Thank you very much. I want to start by setting the stage a little bit. Analytically, at least in the United States, I think one can divide the past 50, 60 years into what we could call the traditional environment or traditional context and the changed environment. And in the traditional environment, students, we had a relatively homogeneous population going to college. In the 1960s, when I went to college, women joined the males, and then we had a beginning of a continuing push, of course, for our diverse, very important groups, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and so on. But whereas the assumption could be made in the traditional environment that students, when they came to college as freshmen, were college ready, meaning they could read, write, and at least do arithmetic. Today, in the changed environment, we have a heterogeneous population, and one cannot make those assumptions. A recent ACT study showed that about 40% only of the students arriving at college had those skills. And there's unfortunately a good deal of qualitative evidence that students leave college without the kinds of skills that we used to be able to assume equated with a BA degree. We also could assume in the traditional environment that faculty, permanent faculty, staffed the departments, recommended who to hire, what to teach, and how to assess the students' results. You need a critical mass for that kind of function to be carried out in a decentralized college or university structure, which marks the American case. And today, 70% of the faculty are adjuncts or non-permanent faculty. That's a huge change, and that means that only a few selective institutions still meet the test of that older traditional context. Now, the second point I'll just make is that universities really perform two public goods in my vocabulary: research and undergraduate education. For research, we do have at least a basic continuous system of improvement monitored by peer review. You just can't assert that you're the best researcher or the best institution. There really are objective indicators. And I'm going to use that concept peer review in a moment at the end when I address the point that Kathleen and Charlie brought up about the possible or the disconnect between accountability and improvement, because I share their hesitation or fears, but peer review could be the concept that could be employed there productively. We, a small group at RAND at the end of the 90s, to see whether we could make a contribution to assessment in higher education. And there were a couple of markers that we had. One of my colleagues had developed or recommended performance assessment, which I'll talk also about, for the bar exam in the United States. In the late 70s, Supreme Court judges and partners of the big law firms were upset about the quality of law students coming out of law school. They couldn't make proper oral and written arguments, which is unfortunate if you're a lawyer. And the result was the clinical part of the bar exam. It's in all the states now. And then secondly, we were at RAND, and the value-added movement in healthcare was initiated at RAND, and that was an interesting marker for me because health, of course, it's It's a very different subject, but there's some commonalities. And that movement also started out with a lot of hurdles and lots of issues to contend with, but it's gradually taken hold over the last 4 or 5 decades, and in fact is an important part of the medical environment. We then started out with 2 or 3 premises that I just want to state at the beginning. Improvement was going to be our mantra as well. We were focused on improvement. We were going to try to maintain, not try. My group, led by, on the measurement science side, Steve Klein, a very tough-minded, well-known measurement scientist, made sure that whatever we did would meet the highest standards of reliability and validity, because if you don't do that, you really don't have clarity, and you don't have something that's going to be sustainable over time. We also needed funding, and as has been noted, in the American environment, we don't have any Department of Education authority doing this kind or stimulating this kind of thing, or accreditation agency. So we were successful in raising a significant amount of funding from the major foundations to launch what we have done. The first thing that I want to talk about is just what is the CLA itself. Well, it does measure critical thinking skills, and I note there the 5 categories. These skills, time after time, faculty and employers all rank at the highest. They're not sufficient, but they do note these skills as core cognitive skills that are requisites for success in college and work. And with them, we purport to provide within or cross-institutional benchmarks for measuring improvement. And in turn, I'm going to give you examples or evidence that how they are used to influence curriculum. And this CLA plus, the plus part is we now have a version of the protocol that's reliable at the individual student level, which is important. And that provides results that are normed. Students are compared with each other. But then we also have standard setting exercises which provide proficiency levels that are recommended by focus groups made up of professors, some business persons, and policymakers. It actually is a 90-minute test comprised of a performance task and then 25 selective responses which have the characteristics of these performance tasks. And you do have the student and the school then as possible units of analysis. Now, control is mentioned there. The friendly amendment I would make to the definition is that we would argue that for learning gains, you need to have some proxy for the abilities that students bring to the program when they start. Because if you don't do that, you're going to give advantages to highly selective colleges, and you don't want to do that. All of the testing ends up being done over the internet. Now, when we started, we didn't know that that could occur. I know that sounds feeble at this point, but 15 years ago, it was a question. So it was a game changer because we didn't invent performance assessment. These constructed essays, open-ended constructed essays, which are not going to be, many of the people here will smile because when you went through college, that's exactly what you did. You weren't burdened with a multiple choice paradigm that we had in the States. But it's used for all aspects of the program. And now, computer-assisted scoring actually does score these long essays at the same level of reliability, some would say a little bit better than human scoring, both well above 0.80 levels of inter-rater reliability. Here's a list of performance tasks. I'm not really going to go into any of the detail. It just shows you some of the topics. At the end of the briefing, there are links so people can actually go look at a task, which I think is important, because what I want to just assert, I'll say something about it, I guess, in a little bit as well, is that the U.S. at least is now moving swiftly beyond the multiple choice paradigm. And in 2012, the Department of Education set aside $360 million for 21st century test development as part of the Common Core movement in K through 12. And out of that has come a massive effort to use educational technology to develop develop interactive games and speaking and listening versions of these tests and so on. So whatever you do, you should note that. We think that performance assessment is actually something to look at. It's not that it's superior as a technology to the multiple choice paradigm. But in fact, it is desirable because these tests themselves model the kinds of practices that are important for both students and professors to take account of when they're engaged in teaching and learning. And in that sense, there is a sense in which I'll claim that they're a bit superior to multiple choice tests alone. That means that class time spent on these kinds of tests are really an educational value itself. They're really a case or a problem approach. And whereas multiple choice tests are it's not a good idea to teach to them. There aren't any right or wrong answers to these kinds of tests, and therefore teaching to them is not a bad idea. Now, critical thinking tests are contested in Europe, still in the States by many faculty. The testing organizations, I might add, that are involved, the measurement scientists don't really believe they're contested anymore. These skills are situated on top of disciplines. They're not what we would call Spearman's G. They're these broad abilities that are applicable across an array of disciplines. The next issue aren't there inevitable interaction effects with majors disciplines because you have to have substance. You can't just think about critical things in the abstracts. And here's the chemistry flame test. Students are evaluated on whether they can figure out the chemical composition of an unknown substance. But of course, they're also evaluated on the appropriateness of the test they ran, the sequence, and then what their evaluation consisted of. Therefore, that test, this test requires both substantive and procedural knowledge, and that's what these performance assessments are about as well. You get all of the information you need to do the test, and they're testing your ability to carry it out. Value-added approach. Our version of this is a matrix sampling approach. It's counterintuitive, but the school, the institution, is the unit of analysis. And you have built in these measures of entering competencies. In the U.S., a lot of schools require the SAT or the ACT. And so we have been using that. Now, critics argue that, look, it's all bogus because attrition effects mean that the poor students drop out, only the higher ability students remain, and that explains all the value added. And here, I just report the differences in entering academic abilities of freshmen and seniors, both groups. And we actually get all the registrar data for the students at test and the students at the institution. There's only a 20-point difference between the two groups over an 8 years of testing. And that's a mean size effect of about 0.73, 0.44 standard deviation. That's a healthy effect in social science. So at least everybody here that's a professor or from a university doesn't have to blanch when some crass business person says, well, you don't really do anything that adds value anyway. That's the debate in the States that we actually got unwittingly pulled into because a research study was done on our data, and then our Tea Party colleagues and the Republicans said, well, we don't need college at all. Here is a curve of the value-added results for several years, and it does show, I don't disagree with what Charlie noted about the importance of within variation, but when you actually look at these results, you do see a classic bell-shaped curve. And that does indicate two things. Number one, college does matter. And secondly, there is a significant number that are above the mean, so it matters where you go to college. That's an invitation for best practice research, the kind of work that Kathleen and Charlie noted. And a great deal of food for thought. Now, why then compare? Compare institutions or, frankly, even international comparisons? Well, again, there are no silver bullets in this world. You have to be modest. There is a single test doesn't give you enough information to make decisions about the topic that you're looking at. But in fact, there's a bit of a paradox, because if you don't have some ways to compare yourselves objectively at an institution with other similarly situated institutions, how do you know how well you're doing? Again, you have that problem of being not having any metrics to objective metrics to do that as well. International comparisons are very challenging. Our group was part of the HALO study, which had mixed results, but we did learn a lot. And there are actually ways to compare these kinds of standardized tests, but you have to be very careful about it. They're a good idea because, again, you're able to learn a good deal about what you're doing well or not doing so well as well. Other questions, I guess the one that I'll talk about here, number one, aren't all standardized tests bad because they're reductive, etc.? Well, yes, they are, but the CLA Plus, actually, it's a holistic test of skills that, in fact, are not taught directly within individual majors only. And education, I'll remind all of us, is a joint product. An individual student is not a function of their major or their courses, but all of their experiences, and therefore it's we would argue, a useful test. Testing results, we have a division, CLA Education. We've had about 120 or 30 performance academies in which 2,000–3,000 now professors have been taught how to develop their own performance kinds of assessments, and then they take them back to their colleges and universities, develop new curriculum, courses, that kind of thing, and that's very important. It's very important to be able to at least give the academy some ideas about how to use this stuff, and we have not done anywhere near enough. It's got to be put on the web to do better. All right, so I noted the measurement science community. We did a joint study together a few years ago that critical thinking, at least by the American measurement scientists, is real. The Department of Education funded these new assessments, and you've got computer-assisted scoring that creates these opportunities for performance assessment in the classroom. I'll just say one other thing about measurement science. There's an assumption of the equivalence of knowledge that academics make universally. The assumption, I'm a political scientist, a political economy, and it's part of the code that one assumes that art historians, my wife happens to be one, sociologists, scientists, et cetera, are all doing work based on a paradigm that is important, and they're therefore the academy. There are good reasons for that assumption because, for example, with AIDS, when it started, we only began to make progress because there was a small group in veterinary medicine doing work with monkeys with retroviruses that had some purchase, had some use in the AIDS area. My point, measurement science is too important a field to be discounted by those who would say it doesn't have any, the work isn't valid, it's not reliable, we don't need it. I'm just going to assert anything that is going to have stakes attached to it better have a strong case for reliability, validity, and fairness and cost, and leave it there. Now, the problem, where are we today? Well, it's mixed. We do have some hundreds of colleges testing, a couple hundred a year, maybe 1,000 or so testing every few years, that kind of thing. And it's extended to this approach to high school and in middle school. But it's still, frankly, a niche product because it's a no-stakes test. And that means it's hard to get the sample sometimes. Remember, we actually compare the sample to see whether it is similar to the demographic characteristics of the university to try to make sure that it is representative. And the truth is, professors don't have clear incentives to actually improve what they're doing in the classroom. I think Charlie and Kathleen gave you some good examples of that. Now, what we've decided to do, the decision we've made is to align the value-added approach and our learning gains protocol to another test in the college to career space. So that's what I'm going to end with just a few thoughts on to give you a sense of what we're doing now. The problem is that in the college to career space, too many students that go to less selective colleges of high ability never get an interview because employers don't know where they are. And employers don't get a chance to find many talented students graduating from college that do have the skills that they need for their jobs because they don't have the tools to find them. It's really what we would call a market failure. Why is the market failure so pronounced now in the U.S. at least? The mean GPA for graduating seniors nationally is 3.3 on a 4-point scale. So everybody lives in what we call is Lake Wobegon. They're all above average. And unfortunately, the students then don't have a way to differentiate themselves. The problem, you've got then a small set of selected colleges. There are about 143. I want to show it to you here. On the East Coast, these colleges were mainly born in the 18th, 19th centuries when the country had a population of 50 million or less. You've heard of a lot of them. But now today, we're a country of about 330 million, realistically, and we're going to have a population growth of 70, 90 million over the next several decades. Under those conditions, you have only, because of these colleges actually represent the proxy for quality, you have a situation in which this small set of colleges determines the future and the fates students all over the rest of the country. That's just not sustainable when you have a country of that size. What we were able to do, because of the large N we have of, from the CLA testing, is do an estimate which divided, using the division between selective and less selective colleges, we were able to show that 33% of the students in the selective colleges do score in the top 10% of the CLA plus, and only 9% in the less selective colleges. But then when you translate that into numbers, you're talking about a 2 to 1 ratio in the top 5% selective, non-selective, or less selective, and then it goes up to a 6 to 1 ratio reversed in terms of numbers when you get down to the top 50% or so. The point, you really do have a large number of hidden gems that appear to be absolutely equivalent in skills to the students in those top schools. So that's what we're attacking. We're not doing work readiness assessments. I told you what the CLA measures. The work readiness assessments that I list here are the ability tests, the tests that employers use. And frankly, they do have some issues associated with reliability and validity issues. And most importantly, they don't deal with this market failure question. So we're proposing using the CLA Plus extended with some ed tech aids as a pre-screening tool to, in fact, help bring employers and students together. So now we're talking about badges, we're talking about employment boards, and there's a virtual fair that, in fact, invites employers and qualified students to meet with each other. We've got pilots underway right now, one in Texas. Dr. Kostores mentioned Italy. And a couple of others that will be happening later this spring. I think probably countries in the European Union and elsewhere, everybody has different circumstances, but they face similar issues. Here are the factors then that seems to me to really create the need for standardized tests. The importance of human capital. We still haven't connected the dots, but I think most policymakers do get it that the knowledge, experience, and skills of a population are the only asset any country has, and education is the formal venue to enhance that. Cost disease problem, combined with declining public resources, presents a need for metrics to evaluate productivity enhancement ideas and quality of outcomes. That's a huge problem in the States. It's been mentioned here. There's confusion right now over what should be public, what should be private. In the language of political economy, that's a common pool problem, and it's a very dangerous situation because you don't have any agreement any longer about who should get what proportion of the benefits and who should pay what proportion of the costs. And no, higher education is not a private good, simply or alone. It's certainly a public good as well. Equally important, though, is this drive for equal opportunity. If you don't have that, if you don't have a level playing field, I think it's going to increasingly be a problem in liberal democracies that we live in. And that's the situation we have in the States, where there's probably more inequality economically than anywhere else. So the goal, make assessments both formative and standardized essential to teaching and learning. And when we have accomplished that, we're going to have a significant step toward this continuous system of improvement. I think peer review should be used as a principle in anything we do to actually resolve or reconcile accountability and assessment. In peer review, when you or I submit an article or we apply for a grant, we get a frank review, but we don't want the results published in The Guardian the next day. And I don't think that's going to change. So thinking about the situation here, I just note a few things. If you want to adapt some things from the U.S. context, that's fine. But even there, you need to really take ownership and adapt them to your circumstances. I can say personally, I've been married to a British woman for 42 years, and the languages do pass somewhat in the night, and that's not going to change. The value-added approach is possible here, but as some of you already pointed out, you have a more specialized 3-year degree, so you're going to have to make adjustments on that. Propensity matching analysis, which we've been developing, others are beginning to look at it around the states as well. It's well known in the health sciences. It allows you to compare apples to apples, which has been one of the problems with. You're able to use demographic variables in the U.S. at least. Fathers' education levels turns out to be very important as well. So I think there's some possibilities there. And whatever you do, if you end up, I'm talking now to the government officials here, think about creating an independent commission to govern something like this, which involves higher ed leaders as well. Thank you.